Greetings and salutations, folks, and welcome to my review of sorts for the 2015 film Mr. Right. If you're here, you probably know what it is, but if for some reason you managed to make your way over to my corner of the internet without knowledge of what Mr. Right is about, just so you know, there will be spoilers. I don't think my discussion would ruin the movie, but if you're worried about that sort of thing, I recommend putting a stop now and go watch the movie. It's not bad. The movie is an action romantic comedy written by Max Landis and directed by Paco Cabezas, with Sam Rockwell, Anna Kendrick, and Tim Roth starring, with a budget of $8 million. Sam stars as a hitman who has suddenly discovered himself to have a heart of gold. Instead of accepting assignments to murder people and then murdering them, he accepts the assignments and then kills the people who hired him because, in his words, murder is wrong. Anna is a young woman who had attempted to surprise her boyfriend, only to see him crash into their apartment with another woman. She's up and on the rebound, looking to pick herself on her feet. It's a quirky little flick that's fun at times, but when I walked away from it, I found the experience of watching the movie to be okay. It wasn't a bad movie, it wasn't a good movie, it was just okay. It felt like there was something that was missing from the whole experience. Now, there's something important to note about the budget of the movie. At $8 million, it's for an action movie on the low end. In comparison, the original Karate Kid, a full 3 decades prior, cost the same numbered amount. It's that reason that makes everything I say come along with a grain of salt, because I have no knowledge in how the budget was appropriated. I cannot tell you how much money was spent on casting, how much was spent on the action scenes, and how much was requested to make the movie. Were there greater ambitions behind the scenes that got dropped because of money? So when I talk about what Mr. Right could have been, I think I'm considering an idealized Mr. Right. First off, before I go into it, some context. Mr. Right is basically a romantic comedy with action. Girl meets boy, girl falls for boy, discovers he kills people, and then has to decide between continuing her relationship with boy or leaving him for less murdery pastures. She then decides on love. You know how most romantic comedies go. And without further ado, here are my top 5 things missing from the 2015 film Mr. Right. Number 5. No alternative option for Martha's character. So in the movie, Anna Kendrick's character, a woman named Martha, is presented with a choice. On one hand, she can choose to leave Mr. Right, and her story ends. Mr. Right leaves her forever, and she'll wake up in a bed, wondering about what could have been. Or she could stick with him, and she'll stay in Wonderland, and Mr. Right will be there to show her how deep the rabbit hole goes. Or in other words, her choice is to stay with the boy or leave the boy. The main conflict she has to deal with is the fact that Mr. Right is a professional killer, a murderer. He's even killed people while on their own dates. This leads to a moment in the middle of the film in which Martha is forced to make that choice. On one hand, there is Mr. Right telling her that he loves her. He knows this because he's met her several days ago and feels a very strong connection to her because his recognition of her ability to predict movement. I'll get to that in a bit. On the other hand, there is her roommate. She's there to remind Martha that Mr. Right is a professional hitman who built a career killing people for a living. Also, Mr. Right might be insane. Consider the movie The Matrix. In the movie The Matrix, Neo has to make a choice between the real world or the digital simulation. He can choose to leave the Matrix, or he can choose to stay and forget that he was ever given a choice. That said, it's not like there's a life he's leaving behind. He has no real family. And besides, the film didn't introduce any. His career isn't real. His life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the Matrix. The choice that he's given is heavily weighted toward taking that red pill. At the same time, however, the fictional character of Martha in the fictional movie Mr. Right exists within an expected, realistic version of life. This means that as a human being living in the city, Martha has family, friends, a job, her own goals and desires that, in theory, she has. Because the film isn't going to tell you what she wants as much as imply that she wanted all of this time, was a man. If only she had a Mr. Right. Now, as this is a work of fiction, I suppose a question can be asked, what is the problem with this? Why would I I think it would be better if there was something for Martha to have to leave behind by falling in love with this murdering hitman. The reason is, if she has nothing holding her back, then the choice is obvious. Consider the Twilight series, for instance. Protagonist Bella Swan is presented with two choices. Does she want to bang Edward the vampire or Jacob the werewolf? The problem with this choice is that Jacob never appears like a serious contender. She only spends time with him when she's on the rebound, so the eventual point in time in which she chooses Edward over Jacob is just that, eventual. When Martha finally makes the decision to stay with Mr. Right, it's eventual. She has no other choices. If she had another choice, then there would be tension. If there's nothing for Martha to want outside of Mr. Right, then the alternate choice is the same as the blue pill for Neo, a choice for nothing. Number 4. Previous setup for Martha's character's magical instinct ability. In this movie, Mr. Right can dodge sniper bullets. There's a scene where people throw knives at each other, catching them in the last second. It's because the people involved, along with Mr. Right, sense the air around them differently. Consider, for instance, Newton's first law of motion. An object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line, unless acted upon by an external force. Imagine, for instance, you're walking through a convenience store. On the corner of the shelf is a precariously stacked column of condom boxes. If no force acts on it, the boxes of condoms remain in place. If, however, two lost souls converge upon the corner from two separate directions, there is a chance that one of them will knock into the shelf, knocking the boxes into the air. The direction in which the boxes fly through the air and land is not dictated by some sort of magic, but rather by physics. Mr. Right catches all of the boxes of condoms because he can recognize the connection the boxes make in relation to him. He can sense their movement without calculating their trajectory or speed, and effortlessly catches them all. Martha can also do this. Yes, I realize this superpower makes no sense and is dumb. It looks cool, though. So, there's that. However, the first time we see her recognize her own ability to understand her own connection with the movement of the things around her by instinct and not by calculation happens when Mr. Right challenges her by throwing knives at her. This is the first time we see her sensing the movement around her. By this point, we've only seen Mr. Right sense the movement around her. My understanding of this ability is that it runs on instinct. It's like, have you ever tried to do something, but the more you think about the act of doing something, the worse it gets? That if you just went with your gut, you probably would have been okay the first time? That's the idea I've gotten in regard to this sensation of Mr. Right's and Martha's. A sense of movement that functions more on instinct than thought. Consider the beginning of the movie. When we meet Martha, she's attempting to make lunch? Dinner? She's attempting to prepare a meal for her boyfriend. She fails at it and orders Chinese takeout. Her boyfriend comes home, except he's brought another woman with him. He blames his cheating on her inability to be adventurous. She takes a bottle of wine with her and then throws the bottle at his head. We're introduced to a clumsy woman who screws up cooking, but is really accurate at throwing a wine bottle. This offers two chances for the film to present her recognition of movement. The first, when she's attempting to cook, she's overthinking herself. She's clumsy. Maybe she tries to flip something with a spatula. She picks up the spatula and flips the food in the air in an attempt to be fancy. But it takes her a couple tries to do it. She moves her arm, preparing herself for the motion, imagining the arc the food will travel on its way up and back down. And then she flips the food, but in the process shifts her arm forward, hitting the spatula on the rim of the frying pan, knocking the piece of food backwards. As she seems frozen in place, her eyes follow the trajectory of the food, but she remains still, doing nothing as the food crashes onto the floor behind her. That is the introduction that she recognizes the movement. She can see it, but she does not act. Fast forward to her leaving her apartment and her cheating boyfriend. As she's leaving, he finds an object of hers that she's left behind because she kind of just walks out, leaving whatever belongs to her in the apartment behind. Let's say for some reason it's a small figurine. Let's say for some reason it is a ceramic figurine of a Shih Tzu. That way the figurine fits in one hand. He gets upset at her for walking out on him, so he shouts at her that he's better off with his new girlfriend. He picks up the figurine and throws it at her. She hears him shout and turns back to him. Time slows down and we see the figurine flying through the air. As an audience, we realize the figurine is going straight for her. Her eyes move to track the flying object barely visible in her peripherals. By instinct, she reaches out, plucks the figurine out of midair, and hurls the figurine back at her ex. She turns around and walks away, and doesn't see the figurine hit her ex smack in the forehead. Plus, this means that she doesn't throw the bottle of wine and can still get drunk. Number 3. Previous setup for Mr. Wright's character. In the film, Mr. Wright is a former CIA agent turned hitman gone rogue. Over the course of the movie, there are various stories that are told about him that construct a backstory for him. We get a strong impression of what he was like, along with the incident that affected his own trajectory in life. It's Tim Roth's character that represents the past he has run away from. There is a very brief scene that introduces the idea that he is in communication with some sort of authority above him, but that's never developed on. His goal is a bit ambiguous at first. It seems like he's trying to kill Mr. Wright, but as the story continues, it appears that the primary goal of assassination also has the alternative goal of snatching him up alive and sending him back into the agency. At the same time, there appear to be channels or channels that Mr. Wright can access for the purpose of getting jobs to kill people. The online murder board, so to speak. He still seems to be able to access a certain set of job listings that give him the ability to carry out assassinations, while also knowing who hired him for the assassinations. Now, if there's anything that can be learned from Solo, a Star Wars story, it's that not everything needs an explanation. We don't really need to know what Mr. Wright's call sign was, what missions he tended to be on, or really even how he accesses these jobs. I guess there's the assumption that there is some means of communication that allows a hitman to get jobs. To talk about what's missing, I'd like to spend a little time talking about another hitman. His name is John Wick. If we just looked at the first John Wick movie, consider what elements of the hidden world John Wick belongs to that we see. There's the hotel most prominently, the monetary system, the relationships held between the different groups of criminals. John Wick tells a story about a man who left a specific sort of life, pulled back in. And that's what's largely missing from Mr. Wright, that alternate world that he had left. The presence of the authority would also fill in something else that's missing for the movie, and that is an arc for Mr. Wright's character. Martha has an arc. She's an ordinary girl who considers herself ordinary. She meets this guy who believes in her and learns to believe in herself. Mr. Wright is a former hitman who meets a girl and falls in love at first sight. There are no other developments for that character for the rest of the movie. Let's say, for instance, there was an authority, and let's say that authority discovered his relationship with Martha. They could perhaps threaten her life if he doesn't do jobs for them. So in short, the presence of a backstory for Mr. Wright would not only develop the world of the movie, but also potentially help develop his character. Number 2. No significant challenge for Mr. Wright. At the beginning of the movie, Tim Roth's character, Hopper, is in a van with 4 heavily armed mercenaries. They're joking around before the mission, and when the time comes to fall out and take down Mr. Wright, Hopper doesn't follow. He explains that he thought they were professionals, and they surely will all die horribly. The 4 mercs enter the building to confront Mr. Wright, and then they all die horribly. Later on, there's a scene where someone confronts Mr. Wright at a restaurant. They step outside, there's a brief kerfuffle, and the man is dead, Mr. Wright untouched. At the end of the movie, Miss Hopper and Mr. Wright take each other on in a fist fight in the rain, which was cliché when John Wick did it a year before. Up until then, Mr. Wright finds himself fighting against an array of mobsters who are all terrible, well, with one exception. He steams over everyone fairly easily, which is to be expected, really. When the movie starts, he's fighting against well-equipped mercs. By the time the mob shows up, it's pointed out how poorly equipped these goons are. And if they're not poorly equipped, they're largely horribly inept. Now, I realize that this movie is meant to be this quirky, oddball sort of film. The idea of spending this much time taking this movie this seriously is probably missing the point to some degree. especially considering the part of the movie in which guys are pointing guns at each other, exchanging opinions on gummy bears. At the same time, though, because the villains are so pathetically inept, that by the time Mr. Right confronts Hopper, or by the time Martha is forced to defend herself, there is no tension in any fight scene. Consider, for instance, The Matrix and then its sequels. In the first movie, every fight scene with agents contains tension. When we first see the agents, Trinity is running from them. Morpheus and crew are hiding from them. Neo is told if he sees them to run. When Morpheus confronts Agent Smith, he loses very easily. When Neo decides to stand his ground and fight Agent Smith in the subway, this is a turn for his character. When Neo becomes the one at the end of the film and can see the Matrix for what it is, it's the agent's turn to run. So when at the beginning of the Matrix Reloaded, it's Neo against agents, of course he's gonna win. He's the one. When Neo is fighting against the ghosts in the mansion, of course he's going to win. He's the one. When Neo is fighting against the pile of Agent Smiths, sure, there's more Agent Smiths, but that doesn't change the fact that they're just as tough as they were in the first movie, and Neo is still the one. The fighting is fancy, the choreography oftentimes excellent, but there's no reason to care about any of the fight scenes until Neo is separated from the group. When we meet Mr. Right at the beginning of the movie, it's quickly established that he's awesome. As the movie continues, his enemies start off as chumps in comparison to him, and they just get worse. He never really acts like he's in any danger because he never really is in any danger. Even when Martha gets involved and him and Martha are under attack, there's no sequence in the film in which Martha is in any danger. She becomes the ideal when it comes to escort quests, standing far and away from danger, presenting very little reason to believe anything will go wrong. Number 1. No tag team battle featuring the two. While a Neo and Morpheus tag team battle would have been really awesome, or at the very least a tag team battle more orchestrated than the rooftop fight involving Neo and Trinity, the point of Neo's progression isn't to look cool fighting bad guys alongside allies. It's about his growth as an individual, his belief in himself. There are subplots involving his relationships with other characters, but his own development means that his abilities will dramatically outpace them. There are two elements of Mr. Right that make it different. The first is the main focus of the film is the romance between Martha and Mr. Right. The second is that she eventually gains his abilities. This dynamic is done better in the Brad Pitt-Angelina Jolie movie Mr. and Mrs. Right. In that movie, they are both assassins. As the movie progresses, we see them fight separately, we see them fight against each other, and then we see them fight alongside each other. With Mr. Right, we see him fight by himself, we see them fight separately, and then the movie is over. For one, it would have been much cooler getting to see the two of them fighting together rather than separately, as the movie would have gotten a better chance to show not only their vague superpowers related to perception, but also show them interacting with each other. And that would probably have been pretty awesome.